little thing sitting right over here is Alice. You want to say hi to Alice? She's a cute little. How many months old are you? 2 or 3? Ah, you're young. It's all good. She tries to climb up my entire leg as a means to get to her favorite part of the house, which is right here. And you're going to be watching this hopefully on YouTube later as I get into my favorite part of this conversation. Now, Stormgate doesn't have an editor that I can manipulate, but I have taken the liberty of going ahead and creating a 3v3 MOBA RTS or something like that. Something representing what I wish Team Mayhem would have for Stormgate. I already had an hour and a half long discussion on a notepad slash paint file where I went ahead and typed everything out, drew some maps and things of that nature, so I thought I would give a little more structure. And for those of you who are a bit more perceptive, yes, this is the second time I'm trying to give this talk. We're going to try and shorten it down, make sure there aren't as many items that come up, and we'll just stick to the topic here because this is actually a multi variant idea. There's multiple levels to what would be wanted in a MOBA RTS. And so this one, we're going to have a PowerPoint to help guide us. You can see the name here. It is Tempest Heroes 2. Tempest Heroes being the name of the tentative project I made inside of the editor of a different RTS game. Tempest Heroes 2, designing the combatants, hero complexity and centralization. So if you're making a MOBA RTS and you don't know what I'm talking about, go ahead and go watch the roughly hour and a half, hour 45-minute long discussion I had in the first video. It's on my YouTube channel describing what I would like a MOBA RTS to have, why I think it should be called a Grappler, what the map layout should be, and a multitude of other items there. But if you are fully briefed onto that, let's get into this. So, hero complexity and centralization. So when we're designing heroes, and we've already talked about the map, we've talked about the broad scale of units that we want and other such things, we're not going into all of the design girders, which are the things that you put in to make sure that your game actually doesn't go too far off the rails on balance. But that's not the purpose of this conversation or this talk. The purpose of this one is heroes. So let's get into it. The first thing we have to talk about for heroes are that there are two axes on which I think you can define heroes, or at least we designed them myself, Ninja5511, and some other players for Tempest Heroes, which is our own take on something that more or less we think a MOBA RTS should look like, a 3v3 game mode, very similar to what Team Mayhem is being proposed, the Team Mayhem game mode being proposed by Frost Giant Studios for Stormgate, which is why we're streaming to Stormgate right now. The two axes to worry about are complexity and centralization. There's a bunch of terms over here on your screen speaking as to what those are, but very simply, there is a graph I'm going to be showing you that is the relationship of the combination of how simple to difficult in a line a character is versus how the power is centralized. Is it in a unit or is it in an army? And the terms here are just something that we can get as a framework so that you can attack the idea on its own merits, and that way we're not losing anyone at the starting step. So if it's simple, there's fewer clicks, it has an intuitive skill set, it has low decision making. That doesn't mean it has low agency, but it does mean that there's a lower overall APM required to go ahead and do it. And then difficult is more clicks, disparate abilities, multivariant decision making. I want to stress that for the complexity argument, it is actually easier to make something that is more skill expressive and expands to larger player counts if you make more difficult heroes. If you make simple heroes, it's very hard to make them interesting without being overpowered or underpowered in a definitive manner. If you listen to Riot August, who talks about champion design in interactions in the game League of Legends. He has a great YouTube Shorts channel that's been popping off the last little bit here. He talks about how when players thought, that he'd give a couple of examples I'm combining here, he thought that when the character Malphite was a bit too strong in terms of its numbers. This is a very basic character. It has an ultimate that is a dash into a knock-up. It has a Q that fires out a pillar that slows people. It can slam the ground and reduce attack speed. It has a passive where it slowly gets health back. It's a very numbers-based character, and there's not a whole lot of outplay potential, in the current season. And we're well past the seasons where it was meta-defining, even if it is sometimes a niche pick or something that is argued for in favor of by people like IMLS. But Riot August made the point that a simple character like Malphite is actually it's a very bad idea to make them overtuned or overpowered because of their simplicity. There's little that you can attack. I'll give you an idea. If a character is being played at a 9 of 10 level, right, or a 10 of 10 level, and there's only 10 areas in which you can separate its skill, then it being played at 10 of 10 means that it can't be caught up to. Now, if there's a very difficult character, maybe the strongest people ever to play that character are playing it at 88 out of 100. But since you have 12 decision points that aren't being made perfectly in this scenario, and there's more axes for failure, there's more points at which you can fail to optimize, then it's easier for more complex characters to be powerful and overtuned, but not be overpowered, at least according to my methodology and my wording. So, and then we worried about centralization. Because this is a MOBA RTS, we actually have two axes with which to attack this. This is something that a player named Fax Tolgia did in their map Heroes and Commanders. The idea is this. You can either put the power in the hero, which is unit, or you can put the power in the army, which is the the other units that you buy. For those of you who weren't around for the first idea of the MOBA RTS or the Grappler that I put in that first hour and a half or so long video, it's a MOBA where you buy units instead of buying permanent power. And so the idea that you can buy a unit means that how your hero works with the army might be more important than how powerful it is individually. This gives us another angle and axis of attack, something that we can use to manipulate the balance of characters or design in a way that you can't really do that even in something like the co-op of StarCraft 2 or even in a game like League of Legends or Dota. So, here's a list of all of the heroes. Here's a visual representation. We're going to be addressing each of these heroes from a left to right axis. Well, I just used that word a ton this talk. Hopefully I can get off of it. Previously it was anathema. Now it's axis. We're going to find a new word that I just repeat ad nauseum. And I don't even have to pay 5 mana to do it with Rograk on the stack. That's right. That's right. I know what I'm on about. So we're going to be going over each of these heroes from left to right, that is to say from what is I perceive the most simple of the characters, least mechanically complex, to the most difficult. Notice that they're on this quadrant, kind of like an Eisenhower quadrant theory, this quadrant theory in Magic the Gathering and other spaces. It's a quadrant of simple versus difficult, and then army versus unit. So we have mostly the simple units are army units, or if they're unit focused, they're very lightly towards that. Mostly the units are difficult, right? Mostly the difficult characters are units or individual based characters. We're going to talk about some of the difficulties that you have in creating a difficult army based character or a simple unit based character. We already touched into a little bit of the difficulties of making a simple unit based character. To introduce the topic, when you make a difficult army based character, it is hard to tell someone who has a lot of mechanical skill and pre-existing game knowledge that they're going to be very powerful by supporting their allies rather than just going and stomping outright. And this can be very difficult for them to parse. It's a rare person who wants to be stronger in a mechanical sense, but leverage that through more supportive gameplay. And these are little images that are made of the 6 characters, the 6 heroes that are currently in Tempest Heroes. If anyone from Frost Giant sees this video and you think that this is interesting, just privately message me. Won't mention your name, won't say that the conversation ever happened. I can point you in the direction of this map. I can get you some of the numbers and the details that are attendant in the ideas here. For the rest of you, we're not going to be talking about exact health values, exact damage values, things like this. What we're really going to be talking about are what is the concept, what are the basic abilities that these characters have, what is the relative perception of their strength. And this matters a lot more than the numbers because design is the framework around which your numbers have relevance and matter, right? It doesn't much matter if I say, well, that the soldier hero has 500 health. Oh no, wait, now he actually has 525. I'm so bad. This way, there is a broadness and applicability to this conversation that extends beyond the very specific patch notes of what the exact health or armor value is of these characters, gets you an idea of what they do. And also, because they have a design, they have a framework for what they are meant to do, what they're meant to look like, and how they are play based on that interaction that they have had, based on the iteration that they have had over these periods of testing as well. We have a pretty solid, myself, Ninja, and the other players of this mode have a pretty solid idea as to what want each of these characters to do. And I think that that means that the player profiles, I mean, almost like the Timmy, Johnny, Spike psychographic profiles of Magic the Gathering, the player profiles that are generated as a consequence of this will apply to Team Mayhem, will apply to Frost Giant Studios, will apply to their efforts to make a 3v3 game mode, and I would love to see some of that brought to life. So we're going to go first for each of these characters. We're going to show their picture in the upper left-hand side. They're going to have 3 slides. One of them is going to be a rough bar graph. For those of you who love power scaling or read a lot of manga, this is a lot like the concentric graphs or the bar graphs or the 1 to 10 graphs that they used to have even for the Avengers and Marvel characters on the back of old cards, right? It's just a rough idea without quite quantifying what the relative skill level is of these characters. I want you to know that while the bar may go from 0 to 5 or 0 to 6, the minimum is 1 and the maximum of 6. So we can see here from the soldier, above average in damage, excels in terms of its toughness, a bit above average in mobility, but not a lot of utility. And not a lot of control. So we'll define this very quickly, but for those of you who've played a lot of League of Legends, damage is just the ability to do damage, whether it is burst or damage over time, although that tends to stack on how much damage can be done as quickly as possible. Toughness is resiliency, it's the ability to withstand damage. Now, it doesn't really care how you do that, whether you have a lot of armor and magic defense, whether you have a lot of hit points, whether you have something that mitigates or blocks a lot of your damage, like the aforementioned Malphite example, it doesn't really care. Control is basically your ability to CC your opponent or use crowd control to debuff them or constrict their movement in some way. Things like removing an enemy's unit's abilities or hampering their movement speed. All of these things are aspects of control. Mobility is purely the mobility of the character in question. So for instance, this is not saying that the soldier has an excellent ability to manipulate the mobility of characters they're fighting. This is saying that the soldier, as itself, as it stands, has good mobility, right? So hopefully that gives you some idea as to what these terms are and what they mean. As we go ahead and organize, move my camera aside. And utility. Utility is the usefulness that this character provides either to an army or on the battlefield when it is engaged with other units. This is also a measure kind of how supportive it is. Now I know I said that this is a very army focused and simple character, so let's get into what some of these numbers mean. So soldier, a simple army type unit. It has 3 active abilities, 2 and an ultimate, and then it has 2 passive abilities. Something you'll notice about simple characters is that they tend to have more passive abilities than active. Passive abilities don't require the player to perform any action in order to get any utility or to get any, well, that's a reserved term now because of the chart that I showed previously. It doesn't require the player to take any individual specific action for them to get the benefit of this, which tends to reduce the number of key presses they have to make. So if we look at the active abilities, Slash, just hit nearby enemies for about medium damage. Shatter, heavy damage to a single target and temporarily remove some of their armor. I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. Armor, in the case of Tempest Heroes, the mod that I'm making with Ninja 5511, works differently than the armor in Stormgate. The armor in Stormgate appears to be armor that is an amount of extra effective hit points that units have. So if you have 5 armor in Stormgate and your unit has 100 health, then it has 105% effective hit points, or 105 HP. So if they had 200 and they had health and 10 armor, then they have effectively 220 health because they have 200 health plus 20 effective health given to them by the damage mitigation of the armor. This is not the way that armor works in the RTS that I am using to make this mod that we're mocking up for our own idea, my own idea of what a 3v3 MOBA-RTS would look like. In this mod, armor is a flat static value, kind of like in StarCraft Brood War, StarCraft 2 as well, where if a unit has 5 armor and an enemy does 17 damage to it, then the damage delta is 17 minus 5 is 12. This is not also a conversation of armor types, so saying that something does bonus versus mechanical or biological or beast or against magical or something like that, none of that is in play. This is purely armor reduction. So remove all units in the game have minimum of 5 armor. The reason for this is that it allows armor it's kind of one of those design girders that allows armor manipulation to be relevant. So we went on a bit of a tangent there, but we'll get back to it. So the play pattern here is you shatter your opponent, remove their armor, you slash, which is kind of a cleave that does some minor AoE damage. Your ultimate, Unyielding, doesn't have a lot of play or mechanical ability to it. You just get increased stats. Basically, you become a stat stick for a while. Increased armor, hit points, hit point regen, and movement speed. So you have more total hit points. You have faster regeneration of your hit points. You have bonus armor so that you take less damage from static attacks and non-basic abilities, and then your movement speed is increased briefly, is slightly is slightly changed. I believe right now you actually have slightly reduced speed, but we're looking at possibly changing that. Now, the two passive abilities are Soldier's Guard and Furious Charge. Soldier's Guard is one of the things that makes this adds to the utility score of this character. The soldier passively grants bonus armor to nearby allies, so this is not going to bring up the exact numbers as in their ironclad, but it's something worth noting and thinking about. So the base armor of this character is, I believe, 4, and he adds 3 armor to, or 5, and he adds 3 armor to himself and all allies. Keep in mind that the waves are constructed in such a way that even the archer, the ranged minion equivalent, if you play a lot of League of Legends or Dota, you'll know what I mean. That has 5 armor minimum, and so if you look at the fact that the waves are balanced around bouncing off of each other and having that solid wave-based interaction from tower to tower with no buffs, adding 3 armor on a unit that has 5 is phenomenal passive utility for the army. He also has Furious Charge, so he has on average, but slightly below average movement speed. Just to put a number to frame in your mind, he has, I think, base 2.5 movement speed. The number doesn't matter. What it does matter is that if we were looking at it, we would say it's average to slightly below average. But his other passive, Furious Charge, means that when he strikes an enemy, he temporarily increases his movement speed. He keeps this right now, current iteration. He has up to 5 possible stacks of this. He attacks once per second. He gets 1 stack every time he attacks. So he has a possibility of attacking 5 times, going up to plus 1.25 movement speed, plus 50% movement speed for a quarter of a second before the stacks start degrading off of him. And so this is why his mobility is rated above average. So we're going to go into the player perception over time. I think that this is very important, and then we'll kind of spitball for a second while we talk about who the hero, the soldier, is really designed for and some of the considerations that went into it. So you can read here, but I'll just say, because of his passive ability and the fact that he does very strong single target damage with his cleave, like his sword swipes, and those are all attack resets. So he can attack, cleave, attack, attack, cleave, attack, swipe, and then, attack, crush, attack, cleave, and just keep going over and over. It's very, very powerful. He has good burst damage potential. It's very possible for you to just get on top of a squishy, do a lot of damage to them very quickly, and then back off. And because he gets movement speed as he's attacking, it's not just enemy heroes, it's while he's attacking the lane. So if you see him, much like if you see a Jax poking the lane repeatedly, you'll know he has tons of stacks of attack speed, and it probably is risky for you to engage in that right away. Much in the same way, it's probably risky for you to walk up to a soldier if you're a squishy caster and you see him attacking the wave, because he's going to get very fast, and then he'll jump on you and he'll just keep hitting you over and over, and then you'll just go down. So the initial impression, very bulky, very strong, doesn't seem to have to do a lot in order to get a lot, and requires a lot of play. Now, I want to talk about this idea that I've got here of the perception over time, which is the initial developing and established. And what this means is, actually, I didn't write a slide to describe this because too many terms gets in your head, and unless you're like practicing to be an ecology student or work as a park ranger or something, you're not memorizing 50 vocab words a week, and I've actually probably already exhausted the limit of what you want to learn. So initial is the very first time that you play. What is your perception of that character, like the first time that you play as it? Is it weak? Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it strong? What are its strengths and its weaknesses? And interestingly, what people tended to discover was that I want you to keep note of what people think their initial impressions are of a lot of these entities. In general, things that seem to have good burst potential or damage potential were ranked very highly by players on their initial play. And then we get to developing. Developing is the second phase. Developing is when a player isn't an expert, wouldn't consider themselves to, be knowledgeable about the topic, but they're starting to have like more nuanced opinions. And typically, almost every time, in fact, the developing impression is counter to the initial impression. It's not that they're counter quite. It's more that they're like being in that aspect of knowledge is being integrated before a full synopsis can be captured. And so the developing player opinion of the soldier is that it doesn't have crowd control, right? Even though it does get faster, it can run up and just beat on opponents, and that's very satisfying, and it can remove armor. It doesn't have any way of stopping an opponent, stunning an opponent, slowing an opponent. Some things just can't be chased down, and so this perception, this reality of lack of CC of crowd control gave the perception that range matchups were impossible for the soldier. Like, yes, he's got a bunch of armor, that's cool, I guess, and he could do damage in theory, but if you play against a competent player and they have range, you have no way of gap closing, this is very difficult for the soldier, makes his life very hard for seemingly no reason. So the next thing I want to talk about here is the established perspective. Now, this is a perspective that a player has had, I would say, after they've played about 10 or so games, with and against their character in question. So they have a pretty solid idea of their initial impression is, they view it more highly because of a thing called the primacy of learning. Excellent for you to learn if you're ever in the educational sphere. But basically, primacy of learning is an idea that says the first thing that somebody learns gets weighed more heavily than any subsequent pieces of information. But because of primacy of learning, there is this overall perception that at least in part, I believe, there's this perception that the soldier is a very strong hero. He's pretty good, but he needs to transition to harassment because while he does help the army with that passive armor scaling, he's not really good against certain matchups since it's against the Sharpshooter, and he can really struggle in a way that, even if you're playing at a higher level, there's a peak, there's a skill threshold that he seems to hit. One of the things I want to note about the soldier is that in the game that I'm using this, in the RTS whose editor I'm using to make this unit, the soldier, its skin, its image, its name, is used as like the default attack unit. It is like the most basic base run up and hit you in the face unit. And what that means is we deliberately decided to take a character who had this familiarity with the established player base and use that and make that a little stronger than it should be and have a good first impression. Now, the reason you do this is people are taking their old knowledge in, right? And so if they're playing a new mod, this is something for Stormgate to really consider, Frost Giant Studios to really consider, if they decide to do something like create War Chasers or some equivalent mini game and release it to the public, is that the player perception of what the units are in other mods, in other game modes, through casts, through other public spaces that they've seen, through memes and jokes and Reddit posts and Twitter and just, again, people's gameplay experience, you kind of have to consider that when you're doing the hero design for things in Team Mayhem, because we've had great success in doing that for Tempest Heroes, because the soldier is seen as a stand and deliver, basic, somewhat simple unit that, just has a melee attack and not too much more than that. By designing a hero concept that is around this, we were actually able to piggyback off of that simplicity and that understanding that players had in the other factions and the other portions of this RTS. And that means that a lot of people come in and have this experience. Now, why is it a simple character? It could be more complex. Well, again, in the base game, people are not used to this being a complex unit, so they don't want to learn a lot of skills and abilities necessarily. Also, it's very important that the characters and the heroes that you orient towards a new player are first and foremost durable, because the first experience that you want to have as a new player is to not get completely shut out of the game immediately. So the most important thing you can actually do is make sure that your base hero, whatever your base hero is, does a good job of, one, being extremely tanky and having a lot of survivability, and two, has an impact on the game state that doesn't require mechanical outplays. Things like passive buffs are very, very good for a new player because it gives them something to say, ha, I accomplished, I achieved, and I was helpful, and I didn't die a whole lot. And as long as they're not dead, players not in a death timer repeatedly, they can play the game and enjoy it. And so on the scale of the 6 heroes, I would say that this is probably the third strongest hero, but that's perfectly okay because he has some hard limitations, and it's almost okay to make things more powerful, to make it more attractive to new players. So I'll give you an idea from D&D, right? It's understood in D&D that Fireball's base damage as a level 3 spell, its relative effect and ability is way too good, right? It's overstated, essentially. The spell is overstated, but it was done on purpose because that makes getting to third level spells, level 5 in D&D for most spellcasters, that makes that spell slot feel worth it. That makes getting that new spell ability feel like you've reached a new tier of power. That was a deliberate design, intention, decision that was made for Fireball specifically. We decided to do something for the soldier. I would like to see a hero or something like the hero in Team Mayhem for Frost Giant Studios. I think it's very important to do so. All right. So, next one we're going to talk about is the Mage, right? Now, this is actually this is the second easiest character in the game, but again, think about how I define simple and difficult. Simple and difficult were, yes, some about decision making, but a lot about the clicks that you had to have, the pre-existing game knowledge that you had to have, you're forgiving the forgiving nature of the character in question, right? And so it was very hard actually to design a simple mage, because a mage is ordinarily a pretty complex character. And so look at this damage, not maxing out, but almost 4.5 out of 5. Its toughness is 1 out of 5. This is one of the squishiest units in the game, lowest armor, lowest hit points of the other heroes. But how does it offset that weakness, right? And it does that by having excellent control ability, because it has the ability, we'll talk about this, to summon path blockers in the way. And then if we look, its mobility is actually pretty good, because while it's not fast and it doesn't have a thing that increases its speed, it does have a means of minor teleportation that lets it get out of minorly bad situations, but not repositioning and hop skipping across the entire map if he makes a mistake. And then the utility is very high for the mage, because he has an aura that passively gives a ton of mana regeneration. The ability to block through control is contributing to the army utility, and his main damaging spell is a fireball, which scales up and becomes more effective the more that the game state progresses, because there are more units, greater chance that a single fireball has higher EV, higher expected value. Now, I want to talk about very briefly some of the challenges of making the mage, which is it's very hard to make a simple character that appeals to people that actually have a desire to use mechanical skills. And so let's go into the mage specifically. You'll see what I mean. Despite this being a simple character, it is of type unit, which means a lot of its power is in the unit itself, not necessarily the army that it supports. Though, if you remember the graph from 2 slides ago, it's about halfway on that vertical plane, in the relationship between unit and army focus. Now, its spells, as I said, are Flames, Flame Wall, and Relocate, so it casts a Fireball. The Fireball is a line trace from itself to a point clicked on the ground, and then the Fireball, while it has a range that you have to be able to click on the ground to go, it extends slightly beyond that maximum range, so you can, just basically use the tipper of Marth's sword, if you get that reference, to get some extra damage off or to hit a bit more range than is expected. There's also a predictive element to it, since it's not fast, but it's like a medium fast style projectile. There's Flame Wall, which summons a tiny flame. This flame is actually, it's not only a body blocker, but it also has an auto attack, so it can help push the wave, and it just helps you establish some dominance. And then it has Relocate to teleport to a nearby location. It has 2 passive abilities. One is its ultimate, one's a regular, one is Arcane Aura. It's just Brilliance Aura from Warcraft 3's Archmage, right? Just give increased mana regeneration rate to all units that are nearby. And then it has Personal Arcane Aura, which just says that you receive the benefit of your own Arcane Aura, right? And that's very, very good. And so, yes, you do spend, in this game, you buy your ultimates, by the way. So let's talk a little bit about how this is the second simplest hero of 6, and then the soldier is the simplest of the 6, yet the soldier looks like it's very newbie friendly, and somehow the mage doesn't. It's a simple character, but it doesn't code itself as actually being anything like the soldier. How is that possible? Well, first off, people have in their minds an archetype, a song, a phrasing, a melody to how they orient around certain ideas, keywords, concepts. And so the soldier in this RTS that I'm borrowing has the idea of you're going to be standing still and you're going to bop, 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 and you're just going to hit people, and it's not complicated. It's understood that mages as spellcasters not only have a secondary resource to manipulate, but they're going to be a bit more complex as characters, right? They're, even in the base game of this RTS, the mage unit already has things that are, pretty complex abilities. It has a slow field. It has a fireball that and previously it used to summon a familiar or a skeleton to go ahead and do damage. So a mage communicates the fantasy that I'm going to have a limited secondary resource, but if I'm smart, I can position things. So it is actually against the ethos, the theorizing, like the player fantasy of the mage, to go ahead and say, oh, well, the mage is just going to do incredible damage with its auto attacks. No, that's not what anyone here is looking for. And in fact, it would feel kind of bad. And what's interesting here is that despite the mage's abilities being simple, and it is simple because it's not mechanically difficult to do a lot of things that it does, and it has some forgivenesses. It has the most range of any character in the game, which contributes a bit to its damage potential. It has more range than the average character, or I think even of all of the other 5 heroes, but it's a bit slower to attack, and so you are playing a sit-back passive game. You're not skill maxing and pounding your keyboard away, but there is some decision making that has to be figured out on what you do, where you go, how you position yourself. And so this means that the mage actually feeds into the idea of a I'm going to position, I'm going to be great, that kind of energy. Yeah, I can do that voice very well. So here's the perception over time the players have had. Yes, there is a space between the R and the T there. I checked the PowerPoint before we went live. The initial impression, again, the initial impression seems to be very favored towards range and range damage and ability to be killed, right? The level 1 analysis in Tempest Heroes. And I mentioned this because this is the impression that I received over multiple people giving their takes on multiple heroes over multiple iterations of design and balance of Tempest Heroes. So I would encourage Frost Giant Studios to go ahead and take a look at this and really consider what the changes between initial developing and established opinions for the heroes, since they said they're going to have them in some form or fashion for Team Mayhem 3v3. Initial impression of the mage is that it deletes armies and it's unkillable in lane. I mean, you saw its abilities. It has a body blocker that it can use to help push the lane because it has separate hit points as a temporary unit with lifetime that can also body attack. It has a fireball, and lanes come in regular ways and cannot be manipulated in any direction or passive manner. And so that's really, really, really good. And also it has a teleport ability, so even if the mage does make a mistake, it actually just teleports out of there. Now, all of these things are good because, again, this is a simple-oriented character, and one of the things you want to do with a simple-oriented character is you want to make sure that they are the things that players who are simple characters are things categorized as simple instead of difficult are those characters that naturally, by various other stimuli or prodding or programming, however you want to say it, or familiarity, if we want to be a little less suspicious about it, those are things that the players are going to naturally gravitate towards. And so the mage is a simple character. Having a get out of jail skill set is actually pretty good because, yes, you can use it to get out of jail, but something I would note as I have watched the design of multiple other games and other heroes and other systems, MOBA-RTSs, MOBAs, RTSs, Battle Royales, anything like this, right, is that utility that can be used for escape very often advances into becoming utility that can be used to kill. So it's interesting that the player perception was that this was a very difficult to handle, unkillable lane god. But the developing opinion was that it has low sustain, it's squishy, and it has overhyped damage. That is to say, if you stand there and let it deliver, yeah, it's going to outpace you in a damage war if you sit there and it has nearly full mana and you get trapped or body blocked in lane with a bunch of minions and just go and just like machine guns fireballs down you. Yeah, you deserve to lose. You deserve to get chased down and killed. But actually, the mage doesn't have very good hit points. It has no sustainability in lane. And then also it's very it's squishy. So actually, once it is taking these trades, it can't afford to continue doing that. And then eventually we got to the established opinion, which is that because of the most hyped aspect of the mage went away from being a 1v1 lane god that's going to sit here and defend against eternity and you can't kill them and they're just unstoppable. It actually became, wait a second, Brilliance Aura is a wonderful support. This Brilliance Aura equivalent, right? This Arcane Aura is wonderful to help support other characters and heroes that are basically balanced or designed around the idea that they're going to suffer because of their low mana and their low ability. And also the fact that he has this ability to soft crowd control while providing that utility means it's very possible, and he could just turn on the damage if he's stocked full of mana, means that the mage is actually not a 1v1 character. Is actually a very good lane partner. It's actually very good to go into a duo lane. We'll talk about the map a bit more, but basically the map it's a 3v3 game. The map is designed around two lanes in a diamond-shaped formation, and then there is no jungle, but there are gold mines that players can buy units, such as workers, to go to mine and get extra value from. So the consideration here is that actually the mage is like, eternally 4-6, 6-4, 5-5. It's actually a very good skill matchup character. So if you're more skilled than your opponent, but it's a 4-6 matchup, you can actually pick the mage and go into a solo lane, but you probably should pick the mage to be the supportive character, the supportive cast to something like a Niko or an Oathbroken that really would benefit from the extra mana, or from a player like the soldier who's going to be getting units like the cleric that need mana, and this will ramp up the pace at which they receive that mana. So next one, again, third, we're going in order from simplicity to difficulty. So we've got the Sharpshooter next, right? So Sharpshooter, you can see, almost maxing out on damage. I will note, for a very different reason than the Mage. Mage has a lot of burst damage. The Sharpshooter over here is just kind of a kiting machine. He's got good damage, nice attack rate, and he can just poke you all of the time. And that's pretty good, actually. His toughness is a little bit below average, if we consider 3 as the average. He has more health than the caster than the Mage that we just saw. But it's not like he's got a lot of great ways to use, bulk himself up or do anything like that. His control ability is slightly above average at 3.5, and that's because he has the ability, unlike the body blocking ability that we saw previously with the Mage, you'll notice a lot of these numbers, if you're adept, are quite similar between the Mage and the Sharpshooter. What makes the control of the Sharpshooter interesting is that its abilities more are on a very particular ability called Hit the Knees, which subtracts 2 movement speed. It's about 50% movement speed reduction for about 2 seconds, and it is an AoE that you have to target, but that's otherwise pretty good. It also has mobility. It's kind of lacking in mobility, right? I mean, it's below average. It doesn't have any ways of speeding itself up. It has average speed, and actually one of the weaknesses of the Sharpshooter we'll get to is that its get out of jail free card isn't really a good get out of jail free card. As for its utility, it gives bonus range to all of its allied units that are near it, and even if you've ever played an RTS or in a MOBA, you know that you can get to any decent level. You can know that range abuse is phenomenally good. And so we have a unit in the Sharpshooter that provokes a very different fantasy from the Mage, and we'll get into the specifics here. So it's a simple army focused unit. It's army focused because its abilities are on pretty lengthy cooldowns, like 15 or 18 seconds, and then it's pretty friendly because it gives passive range benefits to other allied units, and so that means you want it to be in the center in a ball, kind of to be it's kind of like Raynor in the first mission of StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty, where he doesn't have any special abilities. He's just a better, tankier Marine with more damage and more health. And honestly, that's a lot of the times how the Sharpshooter gets used. Has an ability called Mark of Pride. It fires an arrow. All right, so it immediately reveals an area within range, 15. To give you an idea, the towers in this game, killing minions below them, have range 5, and they tie or outrange every single other, hero in the game. Very, very, very good. So range 15, enormous, like triple a tower's range in League of Legends, if you can imagine that, right? Something like that effect. So it instantly reveals that area, then it fires an arrow. That arrow has projectile speed, it travels through the air, and then when the arrow lands, it does damage in an area to all units that have struck. Because of the nature of the arrow, it's easier to hit things that are close than it is to hit things that are far away, but then you don't get the vision bonus. And then we have Hit the Knees. It's the debuff I talked about previously. Debuff enemy movement speed. It does some minor damage. I believe it does less. Spell damage ignores armor in the RTS that I'm using in that editor. And so it actually, after armor, it does something like comparable damage to an auto attack. So it's auto Hit the Knees auto, because one doesn't cause the reset of the other. And it does 50%, roughly 50% lowered movement speed for a period of 2 seconds. Then it has an ultimate called Log Trap. It is an ultimate that after a brief channel of about a second, it does medium AoE damage in a wide area to all affected targets. Now, it has that passive ability I talked about too, Sharpshooter's Virtue, grants bonus range to nearby allies. So I want to talk a little bit before we get into the player reaction to this, their initial developing and then concretized views on the Sharpshooter. I want to notice that this actually fits into the idea that this is a more complex character by traditional means to people who are not familiar with RTS or MOBAs. And what I mean by that is this. Soldier, no one doubts. Very simple run up, hit things melee. Maybe some pullback micro. Maybe some cute tricks with like auto attack, turn, run to go this way with the bonus movement speed. But the Mage is typically thought of to be a more complex hero, but the complexity is supposed to be in your brain. That's the fantasy of playing a mage, of playing a spellcaster, is that your brain is the thing that's massive, and that's going to allow you to use all these tools to prove that your brain is massive and beat your opponent in that manner. The point of the sharpshooter is to prove that your hands are massive. You've got enormous basketball palm gripping hands, and you're just going to go kite. For anyone who doesn't know, you're going to attack, run away, abuse your range advantage, and then just poke, 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 and get closer and closer. And so the player perception of this actually had a lot to do with the relationship that players had to what its design was. Again, we found people overwhelmingly. There are 6 characters, and I've only introduced 3 of them, but most people's first character is one of these 3, and it really fits into their, like, basically their my mental profiling of what they view themselves as, right? The player who plays a lot of aggressive harassment, balls to the wall, aggro, like multitasking, they're going to play something like the sharpshooter. So the kind of person who watches a ton of replays, really thinks critically about build placement, structure, saving a couple seconds, like revolutionizing the game to make a new build that saves 30 gold but is otherwise like perfectly safe against all-ins except this one thing that's actually quite bad otherwise, they're going to play the mage. The person who's like, oh, I've never played an RTS before, I just wonder, what this kind of game is. I want to make a big city, I'm going to send a big army, I'm going to attack. Like the Timmy equivalents, they play a lot of soldier. And so I think we were very successful in communicating the fantasy that each of these players have. I would think of it this way if I were Frost Giant Studios, or if I was someone listening and you don't understand what Frost Giant Studios is doing with Team Mayhem with their 3v3 game mode, I would really stress the idea that you should have this relationship of it's called, I watched a Pirate Software thing earlier where he was like, it's the golden triangle, it's speed, toughness, and damage for RPG enemies, and it's not quite that for this. It's more how the players model themselves, and they model themselves as new brain or hands, right? Whether they want to leverage their brain to win, that's the mage. Whether they want to leverage their hands to win, that is something that's skill checking and taxing, like a kiting sharpshooter. Or they are new, or they want to learn what they want to know about the mode, and they want to. When I say new, I don't mean that they have no legacy skill. What I mean is they might want to figure out, okay, what is the sturdy foundation that I can play long enough to know what's going on? This is like one of the reasons that IMLS, I suspect, my personal interpretation, does things like recommend, hey, if you're bronze and you're in top lane, just play Garen. Just play Garen. You know why? Because he's got a passive that heals him up all the time. You're going to learn some basic interactions, and your ult means you're never fully out of the game, even if you somehow die multiple times, which you probably will because you're new, right? So, new brain hands. Figure out which of these 3 people orient themselves towards, and then, like, leverage that for Team Mayhem. That would be some unsolicited advice that I would offer. So let's go into the perception over time. I'm going to get something to drink right after we do this one. So we've got, again, initial, developing, and established. Initial is the first time that a player plays the character. Developing is over their first couple of iterations of playing with and against it. And established is, oh, okay, I'm not surprised by anything this guy can do. I've played this matchup a couple of times across a couple different matchups. Okay. Initial impression, again, very good notice that very good consistent damage output as opposed to the mage's more control-y, opportunistic damage, right? And the range, like the range being provided, making even your default lane minions have more range. Initial impression, king of kiting, simple game plan to the Nexus. And what that means is, I'm going to fight you in lane, I'm going to battle you until you die, because I'm going to have more range and more kiting, and I'm going to CC and slow your movement speed anytime you could possibly present a threat to me, and then I'm going to do this until I kill you, and then I'm going to kill your tower, and then once I'm done there, I'm going to kill your next tower. I'm going to just take my ball of units that I'm making and come over to your Nexus, and I'm just going to press this advantage until I'm stomping on your throat. That's the initial impression, right? Whether you played as it or against it, that was the initial thought people had. The developing opinion is that it does have a very strong 1v1. This character is very good at 1v1 because all the damage can be focused to a single target in a 1v1, unless it's fighting something like the Druid, which we'll get to, which has some pretty noticeable sustain. It's very difficult for you to actually survive the barrage of hits that this unit will have, but he only has one very tiny AoE CC reduction or crowd control. Hit the knees. very minor, like 50% for 2 seconds slow. And that's on like an 18-second cooldown. And so if he is ever out of position, if we were just playing a MOBA, he would probably be like Ashe. Very, very solid to the point that you have to nerf it multiple times to try and keep it out of pro play. But oh wait, you can't, because actually just the fundamental character design of this character performs this slow on hit is just way too broken, it turns out. And that as long as it's even close to viable, it's just god tier. It's amazing. But very susceptible, much like Ashe in League of Legends, susceptible to ganks or to army. This is not something that scales well with the army that it's fighting, but it does pretty well in helping your army scale against whatever it's threatening. This is also a unit that, again, no movement speed, no teleport. You notice the soldier can get faster by hitting things. The mage just has a straight up blink, like blink stalker level range even, maybe barely below that, quite good. There's no way if you're pressed too far forward on an enemy tower and you get ganked that you can stop that from really attacking you. Also, kind of a lane god, but only in lane. Not really able to harass, not really good for ganking necessarily because of how long it gets over there. It has no burst movement speed to do that. It has no tricks to hide itself. Also not very good at harassing opponent economy because it can get tracked down by a lot of units that are faster than it, and it's very, very hard to deal with. If you're the sharpshooter. The established opinion is, yeah, it's a very strong individual unit, but if you reset it a couple of times, it doesn't get to play the game. This is how, this is why there's a bunch of people all the time everywhere who are bemoaning the fate of things like, I don't know, depending on their game state in League of Legends, we're thinking of Kog'Maw and, oh my gosh, what, Draven, right? We're thinking of people like that. We're kind of thinking also in like fighting games, the character who's like really good, like Chip is a great example. Thank you, David Serlin, for that one. Excels when they've got some advantage state and they're putting you in a neutral state that's heavily in their favor because they can play a guessing game over and over unless you know their tricks and their quirks. Very hard at doing a reset. Actually also natively pushes the lane because of the range advantage and because of how much hero pressure you can put on. And so there's actually this weird balance where you don't want to shove the lane in, and you also don't want to shove the enemy heroes out because this is the hero that gets the most lane swaps out of it. And that actually means that the sharpshooter has a lot of things to do hands-wise, and that feels good for what they want, because again, that's the hands fantasy of a player who is predisposed to pick this as their initial hero in Tempest Heroes, but has a lot of weaknesses that are kind of intended on that playstyle. And you'll notice that that's another thing that was deliberately put in for each of these three simple characters, right? All of their strengths align to what the players expected their strength to be. The soldier, tanky, strong, good for new players, good for survivability. What's the downside of him being good for survivability? Doesn't have a lot of agency on the opponent other than just killing them with damage. You wanted simplicity to be your guide so that you can live. It also is the tool, like the troll. It's a tool that helps you live and the troll that helps you not kill other players. You look at the mage. This is a character that lives by the brain and a secondary resource. That's the fantasy. Has a lot of utility and damage capability and potential, but has a lot of struggles against some of the heroes. And also, if you want to think purely on that, you have this difficulty, which is, oh, but where do I go? Sharpshooter. Like in Tempest Heroes, I would love to again see 3v3 Team Mayhem 3v3 for Frost Giant Studios have something like the Sharpshooter if they're doing this hero design, which they said they are. Something that lives by the hands, die by the hands. The problem is the Sharpshooter, because it's a MOBA-RTS, it's live by the hands, die by the hands means that if your hands aren't good enough, it all goes to shit. If your hands are good enough, you're naturally pushing people forward, then you have to make an even crazier outplay to not suffer from the weaknesses of your own play patterns, your own play style. And so there's a lot of people who, even after playing 10 or so rounds of Tempest Heroes, come back to these three more basic, more simple heroes because they just speak to that primary fantasy. Okay, so now we're going into the complex heroes, or the difficult heroes. These difficult heroes, I want to remind everyone who is new, all of the difficult heroes speak to, so simple is low decision making, intuitive skill, no, like intuitive play pattern, low mechanical requirement, right? Complex is therefore the opposite. These are complex decision making, high mechanical requirement, and high agency characters. And that means actually that they can have more degrees of success. And so what this means is the lows of a complex character are much lower than a simple character. But the highs of a complex character have to be higher than the highs of a simple character, because something like a high excelling simple character would ruin a MOBA-RTS or Tempest, Tempest Heroes, which is the mod that I made, or Team Mayhem 3v3. So let's look at the Druid. Druid is kind of like the Sharpshooter in that he kind of averages out to a bunch of skills. Again, this is just to give you an idea. We'll give you skills and abilities after this. So damage, 3, okay, 1 is minimum, 5 is maximum, 3 is average. Damage, middling. Individual damage, quite low. He could summon a familiar, a pet called Timber. It was a wolf that he can manipulate, and if you've ever played any fighting game ever in the history of eternity, you know that the characters that are multiple characters in one tend to be a nightmare for balance, have insanely good matchups, insanely bad matchups, but be mechanically difficult all the time. Toughness, average. As a spellcaster, actually has about the same toughness of something like the Mage. However, has an army improving spell that gives slightly bonus damage and HP regeneration rate over time. Also, the toughness of the Druid is quite above average because he can use Timber to help body block, and it's a little bit above average because he can heal. That's part of his control. His primary healing ability is called Leaf of Envy. It summons a totem. We'll get into the abilities after this, but it's important that you understand the reason he has average control is that one, Timber is kind of pseudo control because you've got this other unit your opponent really wants to deal with, because Timber actually does a minor attack slow and movement speed debuff on hit. And then the second thing that you want to do is the Leaf of Envy. The healing ability is a pulse that fires 3 times in expanding concentric circles, and each pulse heals allies and slows enemies that are within that area of effect. So this is like starting, again, we said we're getting into complex heroes. This is what we got. Mobility of the Druid, not very good. I mean, he has some minor tricks that he can do, but he can't outright improve his movement speed. One of the slower characters in the game, not outright at a 1, because then he wouldn't be able to move out on the map. Utility, though, very high. Again, has a giant, like this big on the screen of this square, of this camera, this big on the screen. Slightly bonus damage and HP regeneration rate for all units that are on the area that are allied. Your heroes, your allied army units, your opponent, your personal army units, even the lanes themselves can get this, and this can help push waves for you. This is very good. Also, Leaf of Envy, again, it heals, but it does it in 3 pulses, so there's micro potential there, but it also slows, but it also stuns if you're in the exact center of it, at the exact epicenter of it for enemy units. Maxes out at 5 of utility. And this is the first of we're on hero number 4 of the 6, and obviously this will go on YouTube, and I'll save it so people can watch it on Twitch later. And this is one of the characters that we've got. Now, this is one of the hardest fantasies that we had, and you'll see why I explain the ability. So it's a difficult army type hero, and I explained Leaf of Envy, right? It pulses 3 times. A tree falls, it summons Timber, a wolf familiar, because we're using a League of Legends style system where there's both passive income and last hitting gets you economy, similar to what something like Deadlock has, for those of you who have been invited to that or seen that. You can't just AFK run Timber into a position, but as I also explained, anytime you control more than one character in a game where you're supposed to control a character, right, it gets very complex. And Timber's kind of like a free army unit early in the game, but that is only free and good if you can mechanically control him and know where to send him, and he has timed life. And he's not an unkillable minion either. So there's a lot of considerations that go there. And then Twisted Natures, that AoE buff I talked about. We gave the Druid, in line with the idea of complexity, we gave him 2 ultimate abilities. And in this game mode in Tempest Heroes, the way that we made sure we didn't want... if you watch the first video that I did, it's about an hour and a half long. I wouldn't advise watching it except on ×2. If you can listen to my voice at ×2, then cool. If you want to talk to me about it, I'll talk to anyone who wants to hear about it in a not YouTube manner, because the meta of YouTube is to explain everything you know about a topic as much as you can about the topic, because someone's like, oh my gosh, he actually thinks about things. But that's not how I am in direct conversation. So, but one of the things we did is, in that first video I explained, you don't want the heroes to have ultimates that are necessarily selected by players because the players already have enough difficulty microing and controlling these RTS units. Tempest Heroes is just the idea that it's a MOBA RTS where you have a hero and you buy units, and you still have the typical lane assignments and things like that. So having two ultimates here, we wanted one of the gating mechanics to be not level, but money. You can go get this anytime you want, as long as you spend 150 gold. We're experimenting between starting with 0 and 100 gold right now, and one of the main reasons is that we want to see if getting ultimates earlier is worth the cost of not having extra army units, or if it makes it interesting. Two ultimates for this guy: Life Gives and Life Takes. So he either does a massive heal, which is about, it's like 250, right now we're going to change the numbers, but it's something like heal 250 health to an ally immediately and then lose some of your own HP over time. The other ultimate is do immediate medium damage to one enemy and then do healing over time. For anyone who wonders why the numbers aren't the same on this, they can't be. This is the Warcraft 3 whole thing that a lot of ink has been shed over this over the mid 2000s, which I don't want to trudge up here, but basically for anyone who wasn't around then, humans have a paladin who has Holy Light. It heals allies for X amount and then damages undead enemies for half that amount. And then the Death Knight and the undead faction has Death Coil or something named very close to that. And its ability is do the same thing. Damage a target living opponent for X amount and heal an undead, for X. Heal an undead for X amount and then damage the opponent for half of that. But it turns out that because of the way that Warcraft 3 is structured, there's a lot more living non-undead units than there are undead units. And that meant that actually, this is one of the reasons why Paladins with their Holy Light weren't seen as good as the Death Knight. One of many, many, many reasons. But basically, anything that deals damage is just way better than something that heals. It just is in any game like this. And so let's get into this next part. Again, we do this for all of the characters, all of the heroes. If anyone in the chat has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer that. Again, these are things that are in a mod I have made with Ninja 5511 in a different RTS editor called Tempest Heroes. We would love to see in Team Mayhem 3v3 because I think they speak to different player fantasies. And initial reception of my first video about a month ago is pretty positive from the people who privately messaged me afterwards. So, perception over time, initial, developing, and established. Again, for anyone who's new, initial just means the first time the player plays with or against that character. Developing is after they've done it a couple of times and they know what its abilities are. Established is I know what all of the abilities are. I've played this matchup multiple times. I've been on both sides of the matchup even potentially, and this is my experience. So for most of these, right, the impression initially was that they're way too strong for the simple heroes, right? They do too much damage, they have too much utility, they're just unkillable in lane. But I want you to note that the primary fantasy of the Druid is that it is a difficult army-focused unit, and so the initial impression was actually that its damage was poor. It had a hard time last hitting, and it does individually. It has poor wave clear, because its best wave clear is to buff other allied units that are near it, or the lane units that are near it, and then go ahead and use those superior numbers to go hide behind units and kill it, and then slowly stack the HP values so that it wins out against the lane. And the idea was that Timber felt weak, because players initially, when they were playing with Timber, were just running in Timber and trying to have it fight minions, and because one of the design considerations, one of the deliberate design decisions of Tempest Heroes was to, on purpose, have MOBA-style waves, but also on purpose make those waves very, very, very capable and make player leveling scaling per level for heroes not nearly as strong as you would in a traditional MOBA. This means that actually you don't have scenarios where you're level 8 and you can ignore lanes anymore. And that means that Timber, who doesn't level up, is actually not as good as it initially appears at just beating down the lane. It cannot that you spawn 2 melee and 2 ranged units. Timber can't just solo the lane by himself, and that's what people thought he was very weak. This is the no damage spellcaster with a lot of utility that does nothing. The developing opinion was that actually it's very hard to kill the Druid because he's got decent range and a decent attack. Timber is an excellent scouting tool. His ults are both very strong. Even though the healing one was not considered as strong for a while, it's still worth getting because you can heal something up massively, right? And eventually, the player perception was this: it's an oddball. Now, I've asked a lot of people who I'd consider very good at RTS games, and they have credentials outside of my home game, to tell me they're very good at RTS games. And their perception overall is that they think that Druid is like, he's in a good spot, but they don't like playing him. And this is actually one of the things that made Druid interesting, and I would encourage Frost Giant Studios to think about if they're ever approaching a difficult army-focused caster, is that it's very hard it's easy to make that effective, but it's very hard to make that interesting to players who have mechanical ability. Because if I am very, very good mechanically, and I can play something that has a lot of complexity to it in a difficult sense, the way I define difficulty, right? Complex decision making, more mechanical skill and clicking required, more judicious use of abilities, more toggles, things like that, right? More tactical brain and hand brain, as it were. Then they don't tend to want to be supportive players. They tend to want to actually win the game. For those of you who know the reference to this shit anime, no one wants to actually be the Eminence in Shadow, right? Everyone wants to be Kirito from Sword Art Online, right? They don't want to be like, oh, I'm super goated, but I actually have a legion of people who do most of the work for me. They just want to be the person dual wielding, killing a level 75 floor boss, right? And so strong players think that actually this is a good hero, but they're not, for what the reasons they can't quite quantify. They don't really want to play it. And then less skilled players don't think that this is nearly as strong, don't have as high a rate for this hero, or don't think it's as strong. And that makes sense because it maps to the reality of their agency, their ability to demonstrate prowess in the game. So here, Druid is actually considered an oddball. Like, if you pick it, there's a guy right now who is playing Tempest here, is helping us test it. His name is Dante, and he, I wouldn't say is a very strong mechanical player, but he has said, oh, I really want to be good at Druid because I want to be the guy who's good at this, like, oddball guy. I thought it was an excellent description of Druid, and so let's go for it. Okay, number 5 of 6. Number 5 is 6. So Oathbroken. So look at this thing, right? Damage, toughness, control. All pretty good. What does this actually mean? So damage for, again, 1 is minimum, 5 is maximum. Damage, pretty solid. And we'll get into why. But basically, he has a passive that is on himself that means that he individually, in contrast to the soldier, he individually gets more armor. He individually gets lifesteal on his basic attacks. And he damages enemy units that are within a short range around him. So his toughness is very good, but it's also tied to his ability to do damage, because when you have a character that sustains on lifesteal, the more damage they do, the more lifesteal they have. But if they can't do enough damage, or if they're getting beaten down past their damage, then they're doing very badly. I want you to think of the Oathbroken a lot like Dracula, right? In the game Fury of Dracula. If you've never played that amazing board game, take some time, go play that right now. Basically, in the beginning of a game of Fury of Dracula, Dracula is very strong. You don't have all of your party members aren't together. You haven't stopped a lot of traps. You don't have a lot of cards, and so Dracula coming up and fighting you early is actually a really big concern. He's quite powerful, has a ton of agency, can actually, he has a lot of the map because of the movement mechanics in that game. He has a lot of the map that he can explore. He could be anywhere at any time. You don't have a lot of clues. You don't want to fight him early on. It's really dangerous. But towards the end of the game, players don't want to fight Dracula, even though they're beaten down. And rather, Dracula doesn't want to fight players, even though the players are more beaten down and they have suffered some losses, and maybe they're not in the tip-top shape they were in the start. They have a lot more information as to where Dracula could be. They have a lot more ability to thwart his plans. They're a lot more powerful as they've gone through the game. And so that's a lot of what the Oathbroken feels like. He also has a ton of control. And one of the reasons we wanted to make the Oathbroken this way, where he has a ton of control, a ton of toughness, a ton of damage, and even good mobility, because he has a mode shift form. Like, his ultimate allows him to mode shift from his human form into a werewolf, big stat stick with a ton of damage, and then he gets to mode shift even for 5 seconds at a time into a wolf, high movement speed, get out of jail free card, right? Even though he has all those things, the fact that he's actually a very selfish hero, a very egotistical Blue Lock style hero, Blue Lock for those of you who don't get it, read the manga, don't watch the anime looks like trash. We actually wanted to experiment with making something that was basically the ideal MOBA hero, except bad because this is a grappler. It's a general recruitment army battler. It's a MOBA-RTS, if you want to use that dreaded hyphenation. And so his utility is actually very bad. What does he provide his army? Not much. He's a very complex hero, so you have to spend APM to manipulate him. He's in his ult and out of his ult, and you have to control his mana a lot, so he's very finicky, and that means you can't give too much attention to the other units in your army. He wildly oscillates between how tanky and how fast, how tanky or brittle he is, and how fast or slow he is. And so it makes it very difficult for you to pin down a unit that would be good to support him. He's in many ways the antithetical. He's the antithetical. There we go. We said the word. He's the opposite to the soldier, right? Conceptually and on every level. And actually, here's why. Look at this. Look at this sheet. Look at all this shit. Again, so why, but first of all, before we get into this like word salad, let's say you don't care about what the specific implementation is other than like, oh, I guess that's interesting, right? You can read on the screen. But let's think about this. Why would you make the Oathbroken? Because the Oathbroken, again, the reason you design simple characters is that you give players something that they can latch onto, they can find some familiarity they might like about your game style. The reason you make mechanically complex characters is that you want the players who have invested a lot of time, energy, and effort into your game mode to experience that and feel rewards for doing the things. So I likened it to the last time I tried this video to DDR, and here's what I mean by that, right? If you're just playing DDR and you have it, it's not a thing you do, it's not a lifestyle hobby, it's nothing like that, it's not a competition. It's just like, oh, okay, it's difficult, I guess, and I'm kind of stuttering through it. But if you're someone like me who's played a shit ton of DDR, one of the best things of DDR is that when you get to a certain level of skill, right, pressing the arrows is satisfying for each fantastic you see, or each excellent you see, depending on what you're trying to work on. It's satisfying not to beat the songs, but to do it with a certain quality. There's even like a mad, oh, can this, oh, this song is too easy. Can we please get to like the insane stream? Please. Like this song says that it has 500 notes in 2 minutes. Like, can we please get to the part of the song where it's the chorus? I'm just going like, can we please get to that part of the song? And this is what is happening when you design more complex heroes, is that actually you have two things that are great for you. This is kind of goes back to that Psychographic Profiles Johnny Timmy Spike from Magic the Gathering. Excellent article if you haven't read it that you should. But basically, one of the archetypes of players is known as Spike. And Spike is a player who wants to win. And it was actually remarked in the initial article that defined these, publicly at least, that Spike was the easiest player to make cards for in Magic the Gathering. You know why? If a card has good cost and a good effect, Spike will be happy and will play it. And it's not just they'll play it because they have to. They'll be happy to play it. They feel good about playing good stuff. Right? Much the same way here with the Oathbroken. Why did we make him have so many buttons, so many abilities, so much to do? Well, there's two advantages to doing that. One, it gives that player the reward for pressing the buttons, for doing the thing, for pressing the arrows in DDR, for pressing the, doing the do, right? It makes them feel good. It reinforces all of the effort that they've gone into to acquire that skill. It feels satisfying. But much the other reason that this is good for designers to go ahead and make something like the Oathbroken is that actually, if you have a character who depends on you hands diffing to play them even competently, this is phenomenal for you. Because you actually, the more utility you give a character, the more soft power you give a character. So hard power, we'll just go back. We'll break my rule. Hard power are things like damage and toughness, right? How much health does a thing have? How much damage does it do on a swing? How much damage does that ability do? These are hard. How much movement speed does something have? These are, base movement speed. These are hard. This is hard power. These are things that you either have or you don't, right? But you kind of just passively own them. It's good to invent something like the Oathbroken, who has a lot of soft power. Because look at this. Daybreak. Human form to stun both the target and itself. Okay? Break the armor and improve the movement of a target for a shackle broken. But you could do it to yourself, right? To try and get out of a bad scenario. You can do it to an ally to support them. You can do it to an enemy after you have stunned them, or right before you stun them. So I hit you, remove your armor, stun you, and then hit you again so you don't get the chain. There's a lot of decision making there, right? And notice what's happening here. This guy has insane crowd control, but because it requires you pressing so many buttons, having a lot of crowd control is soft power. It doesn't mean anything until you do something with it. But strong players like pressing the buttons because it rewards them. The more difficult it is for them to do a thing that then leads to a kill, the better they feel, the better an opinion they have, irrespective of the power of the unit itself, right? Now its next thing, Burn to Bear, it basically has a mode shift. It transforms itself into a werewolf. Now this unit by default, I didn't get into this, has very low mana regeneration rate. Mana is just the is the main secondary source of a secondary resource that is used in the game that I come from. When you're mod making, it's just the easiest thing that people understand, right? It ties into things like the mage hero I already discussed. So he has low passive regeneration rate. Passive mana regeneration rate. When he transforms into his ultimate, he has negative mana regeneration rate, right? So he transforms into a werewolf. The werewolf is a big old stat stick, more armor, more damage. This is a character who is passive that's based on lifesteal, so more damage is good, but he's losing mana all the time, and it takes mana. He can either transform himself back into his human form, which costs no mana, or he can do a big smash around him. He does a big wind up, and he does this, and it just cleaves a bunch of enemies, and it does the thing in my game it calls knockback, which is the unit takes damage and then it goes up into the air. It's uncontrollable. It's not something that any player can move, and then it bounces a couple of times and then it stands back up and you can control it again. So this is basically removing control by knocking back all the units surrounding it and making them take damage. This is a very powerful effect, and it has no salvation. It can remove all armor and unit control from a target and itself. So it's like Daybreak, but more powerful. And again, you're basically like in Mordekaiser ult. Like you have a giant amount of stolen bonus stats that make you an actually rolling chat. So if you know salvation somebody like a druid and you're a werewolf, yeah, boom, 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 they're getting smacked down. And again, this feels really good from the more experienced player because they also have this mode shift to Beast Within. If they're in werewolf form, they can transform into a wolf for 5 seconds and it improves their speed. Then they can transform back into their human state or their werewolf state. And every time they do this transformation, there is like a 1 second period where they're just still and casting the ability to transform into their other form. And so this is great because this creates counterplay not only with other players for the more skilled player to like express themselves, but because it's a lot of utility and a lot of soft power, that makes the more experienced player able to improve and get better because there's things that they can mess up all the time. Look at all the decision-making points that we have here. Oh, Life Untold is lifesteal on basic attacks, but I transformed into werewolf form and I went into that, but I overestimated how much damage I could do, or didn't have enough respect for how many units they had there. So I shouldn't have taken that fight right there. Oh, okay, in the laning phase, like I could have done this stack interaction for using the abilities to proc instead of doing this one. Or, oh, wait a second, I actually took the time to go transform into my other state, but there's a catapult like siege unit that they can buy in the game, and so I actually took the wrong time and space to go transform into that. Maybe I can transform somewhere else actually, or maybe actually Beast Within, transforms me into a wolf, and that wolf has bonus attack rate. So like maybe I could use this to break out of like the reduced damage mollify ability that someone else has cast on me. That's an interesting idea too. And all of these decision points give ways for these players to counter each other. So I have actually had fights between me and another soldier. And I'm playing soldier. It's a mirror matchup, and we kill each other at the exact same time. Or sharpshooter, where I kill them, but I had barely any health left, or something like that. Oathbroken, because it's a more difficult and more complex hero, you can have these interactions, and this is what more skilled RTS, endemic to RTS, endemic to MOBA players want. They want some of them. Not all of them, some of them, the most invested of them, want a character that they can just put their proverbial on the ground and say, I am better than you. We had the same options. I win. I have 75% of my hit points. You couldn't do anything to me. And actually, that's great, because then the same thing can be done to them on even finer edges. Because again, I stressed this in the past, the more difficult a character or a hero is, one of the benefits of one of the downsides of developing a complex and difficult hero is that actually you can not have the skill to use it, and there can be a huge swath of the cast that's just unusable for you. This could happen to anyone in any MOBA. You're thinking of an example right now. One of the huge benefits of doing this, however, is that there's not only that skill orientation that I mentioned before, but it gives some upper level limit, and it keeps the fun in the game for people who, yes, they still want to play a casual game, but it's just that their skill level is so high that what they consider casual still has to meet a very high threshold for their input ability. And that's very important. And so it's not a surprise that we actually see that the Oathbroken, here we go, perception, initial developing and established. Most of the players, the first time they saw him, were just thinking, he's actually not that great. He doesn't have a whole lot of mana. He needs his ultimate to do anything. Like, it's not good. Now, this is a lot because he has a lot to take in. There's a lot of tooltips to read, there's a lot of abilities, there's a lot of chaining, he has a lot of options, he has a lot of versatility, and soft power doesn't communicate as well. Notice overwhelmingly the perception of the simple heroes was positive initially, right? That's because they have hard power. It's easy to understand why the mage is good when he can chain cast fireballs. It's easy to understand why the soldier is really strong when he has a ton of armor and gives everyone else extra armor, and he just runs up and hits you with a stick. It's easy to understand why the Sharpshooter is a very good hero when it can kite you. But all of the more powerful characters, or all the more complex characters, are also all of the soft power characters. So notice again, just like the Druid, underwhelming assumption of power here on the part of the Oathbroken. Is that he's mana starved, overpowered ultimate, but like you don't have anything. It's very hard to chain all that together. As a developing ability, right? Great CC and hand stiff possibilities, which is what I was talking about. And then the established part, this is the part that's most important about the Oathbroken. I talked about this about 10 minutes ago. Sorry, it's taking longer and longer to go over these heroes because we're getting into more and more complex ones. The design considerations around them are more complex, and as is the reason for having them, as opposed to why can't you just make it fun and just have like soldier, archer, mage and just have simple stuff and not hand stiff people, bro. I actually think being able to hand stiff someone is why the game has casual appeal and enjoyment. Just look at the popularity of something like Yasuo in League of Legends, despite nerfs. So, and then the established experience is actually something unique to Tempest Heroes, unique to a Grappler, a General Recruitment Army Battler, unique to a MOBA-RTS, which is that the established perspective is that the Oathbroken is a great pick, and he's mechanically expressive, so, action in, input in, action out is fantastic. But multiple army non-bows. And because this is a MOBA-RTS, a Grappler where you buy units, very hard to figure out what unit you buy that goes well with the Oathbroken. And so that means that actually tends to fall off as army sizes become bigger and bigger in the straight up army fight. But he's still pretty good at the not straight up army fight. It's quite relevant there. And so now, after all that, we get to the most complex hero, Niko. Now, the person who made this is basically on a personal mission to make sure I'm convinced at least. Oh, 1 second, let me check something. Whoops. Oh, am I sharing the actual screen instead of the PowerPoint? No, that's terrible. Yeah, we're going to fix that right now. PowerPoint slide. Yes. Okay. Yes, not nearly as cursed. All right, sick. We're just going to check something right now. Yeah, I probably won't club this out of the YouTube. We're just going to make sure that something is going on the way that I think it is. Okay, fantastic. So, last part that we're going to talk about here is the hero design for Niko. And Niko was designed by someone who played the game one shot, really loves that game, wants to see more of that game, thinks it's, a blast, had already spreaded this in. And so this is how we get Niko, the most complex, most unit-focused hero in the entirety of Tempest Heroes. I think it's very important that you have something like this inside of Team Mayhem 3v3 for Frost Giant Studios, because all the things I said about the Oathbroken apply even more so. People want a character that they can work towards, that they can't quite manage now, that they will in the future. Okay, so Niko. Damage slightly above average. This Niko is fundamentally a melee spellcaster with short range. So toughness pretty bad, actually. Has an ability called Pancake that lets him get out of dodge free. You know, he can, gives him bonus movement speed and can heal him. You'll see that in the ability a bit later. But look at this. This is just the epitome of soft power. Damage, barely above average. Toughness, actually pretty low. Control, the ability to manipulate things on the battlefield, actually one. The worst. The control ability in terms of manipulation of the field is, maybe it could be 1.5, but it's very bad because there's no CC ability that you can apply to your opponent in the entirety of the game. You can drop rocks on them, you can heal allies, you can do big AoE damage, you can flip between DPS and heal mode, you can do a bunch of stuff, but you can't actually CC your opponent in any meaningful way. Mobility is above average, not only because the ability mobility is probably averaging at 4 actually instead of 3.5, whereas the hero has a movement speed of 2.5, Niko actually has a movement speed of 3 as a base, as would do some of the other characters, such as the Oathbroken. But one of the things that makes this mobility really good for Niko is that Niko also has an ability called Pancake that he can hit himself and allies with and gives them a temporary burst of movement speed. Final thing, utility. Utility is the biggest reason to use Niko. It's the biggest reason it's a unit-focused, difficult unit. Everything that Niko does is very complex, as you're going to see. I could waste time talking about it here, but this is what a character that is maxing out unit effectiveness and difficulty would look like in Tempest Heroes, and I would love to see a character that looks like this and has similar shortcomings in Team Mayhem 3v3. So, difficult unit. Now, first thing you have to understand is that this is a bimodal character. It is either in a DPS or a heal form. If it is in DPS form or a heal form, it can either cast a bolt that heals allied units along a ray that it casts, or Pancake, mentioned it multiple times, just hit a small area, do a small amount of healing, and then a movement speed buff to go with it. It can also swap to DPS mode. If it does that, then it changes these modes, and it becomes a Bolt of Smite, which does damage, or a Bolt, a Molotov, which does damage and then does damage does damage immediately in an area, then does damage over time. And it has, reflecting this, like, two bimodal aspect, Niko also has two ultimates. One is Chain of Smite. This is either Chain of Smite or Chain of Light. It is either a directed chain that heals or damages a given target. And the second ability, Entify, or otherwise known as the World Machine, gives massive damage, mana regen, and movement, which basically covers all of Niko's weaknesses in terms of giving Niko more movement speed to dodge problems, more mana regen to cycle between more abilities, and more movement speed so that they can and more damage so that their melee attack is quite formidable on top of all of that. Now, he does have a passive ability as one of the few active debuffs that we have for a character in Tempest Heroes, and it's called Unworldly, and it reduces movement speed when Niko is struck by enemy attacks or abilities. If any of you have played One Shot on Steam, all of this will sound familiar, or at least it will sound like a very curious interpretation of the story. Shoutouts to Ninja5511 for making this. So, I want you to know, again, difficult hero. So we're going to align some of the lessons learned here and go into this. So, remember how I said, all of the simple heroes who have hard power are considered very powerful initially, and then their weaknesses are discovered, and then it's kind of okay, they're okay. All of the difficult characters are seen through the lens of being opaque, which means they're not understood, and so it is easy to say, oh, this is actually not as powerful as people think it is, or it's just outright weak. So initial impressions of Niko, you can see here, it's a melee caster with short range. It has low survivability. Yes, it can heal itself a little bit, but only one of its abilities can really heal itself. And on top of that, it has low survivability and is weak in terms of it's a melee range. It's a melee caster. Its spells have short range. It actually doesn't have very good hit points at all. Yes, it's a bit fast, but it has to get into range to do anything. This is a garbage hero, was the overwhelming sentiment from people I would even consider medium skill, like medium tier journeyman level skill in RTS games. Now let's take a look over what the perception is for developing. Players who've played against it, with it, a couple more times. It has a broken utility and a fantastic ultimate in terms of the World Machine, right? Which is just an ultimate that turns it into a stat stick that gives it all the things they could ever possibly want. And then the cost of entry is that it's just a skill issue. Like, just keep playing, just get better, and then you'll be fine enough with Niko. But after people have played around with it, it turns out that you can't have a pure soft power character, because some of the Oh, come on, you. Don't be like this. Don't be like this, machine. Don't be like this to me. Come on. You know what we're on about. Don't be like this. Fantastic. Okay, 1 second while I just display settings. Swap the slides. Fantastic. Excellent. Nailed it. Nailed it in one. And so, player perception actually was that, hey, all this soft power is great. The ultimate is great. There's even utility for one of the weaker ultimates. The Chain of Smite is actually pretty good against bursting towers. It's pretty useful to have multiple possible ultimates. All of this, like flip-flopping and APM switching, is really cool. But it turns out you do need some hard power. Right? And you do need to realize that Niko actually does have short range and does have a melee attack that can make some lane assignments very difficult or APM intensive, but the overall belief of people who have an established perspective of Niko is that Niko is kind of like a better mage. Not purely in that the one is outclassing the other, but the idea of, how the mage has like it has like 4-6, 5-5, and 6-4 matchups, but it doesn't have any like truly inexpressibly dog shit matchups that make it impossible to play the game. The idea is that Niko has much the same, right? Niko has some matchups that are pretty rough, but you can skill lift your way out of them. And actually, you have a lot of utility as the game goes on, and you have a lot of agency through the game. And while you do have the natural weakness of this requiring a ton of APM, if you are a player who does things like the 300 APM challenge and beats it in one go and wonders why everyone else can't do the same thing, then you could probably play something like Niko. Now, I do want to get into one last thing, because we're actually on the last slide of this presentation, which is it bad for the heroes not to be balanced? I would say no. I actually think it is an essential subcomponent of making any game, and I hope Frost Giant does this for Team 3v3, for Team Mayhem 3v3. I think it is an essential subcomponent that there is an understood nature by which difficult champions are, on the average, on the whole, and at their peaks, better than simple heroes. Right? One, because players want to have a bit of personal growth. They want to play something simple and then move up the tier list of things that are more and more complex, require more game knowledge, require more play skill. So they want to feel that personal growth in themselves, making sure that simple characters at their peak and on average are worse than difficult characters at their peak and on average does that. The second thing is, more experienced or more mechanically gifted players, or more trained players, which is I think more accurate than mechanically gifted for all but like 50 people in the world, maybe 500 if you're very generous. Basically, those people don't want to lose to someone that doesn't have the skills that they have, hasn't put in the work that they have. And so it's probably good that just as you want something for players to aspire to, you also want those players who have reached those aspirational edges to see that they can hand stiff other people. They can use their legacy skill or the skill that they have earned in their game mode to go crush their opponents. So does that mean it is bad? Like if we find out, for instance, that the ordering of heroes is Niko and Oathbroken are just the strongest characters and Tempest heroes, is that actually bad? I would argue no, or at the very least, it's better that they're the most powerful characters than, say, something like the Mage and the Soldier hero. And so I really hope that this gives something for the team, for Frost Giant Studios to think about. I hope it gives you, for all of you at home, something to think about. This is at least what I think would be interesting for Team Mayhem 3v3 heroes. There's way more to go into in terms of the types of units that you can buy, the setup that we have in Tempest Heroes for that, the idea of lane assignments. But I think it's important, before we do anything else, to just go ahead and see the heroes themselves. I also want to say this, and part of the reason this took a month to make wasn't just that ideation is hard. Idiocy is easy. Ideation is hard. But actually that creation is even harder than ideation. Surprise to anyone who's never created anything before. So as I've mentioned before, this actually exists right now. If you were to play it today, November 23rd, which is the time of recording, November 23rd, 2024, you would have to go into littlewargame.com and go play the map Tempest Heroes Test B. Again, Tempest Heroes Test B, but I'll be working with Ninja5511 and other players to turn it into the map over the next couple of days. Tempest Heroes. And you can actually play all of these characters out. You can see what they do in action. And I hope that you find that interesting, find that insightful. These are things that I would love to see in Team Mayhem as it gets explored by Frost Giant Studios. And then there's a couple more things that I want to make after this. But again, it's already been an hour and a half. Video's too long for that. And I don't have a PowerPoint. If a PowerPoint can't stop me from almost breaking an hour and a half, what makes you think me going off spontaneously, going off the top of my dome extemporaneously is going to allow me to do that? So this has been what I would want for hero design in a 3v3 MOBA-RTS, which is what people think that Team Mayhem is shaping up to be for Frost Giant Studios. I hope that's interesting to all of you. This will end up being on YouTube shortly, and no, I won't be putting up the first version of this just due to reasons that become quite obvious, in addition to slide changes once you go ahead and see that, if in fact that video is still up and I just don't delete it. So thank you so much everyone who has ended up watching. I hope this is helpful, and again, really looking forward to 3v3. Hope some of the things that are going on Reddit aren't quite what they seem, and yeah, next time something like this perks my interest, I'll be sure to bring it up. So